Thank you very much for these introductions this evening, and it's a great delight to be here and to take part in this remarkable institution. I must confess that I didn't know as much about it before I was asked to do this lecture, but for an organisation that has gone down through the years with free lectures, it is really quite remarkable, and I feel very honoured to be asked to do this lecture. I only met Peter Naylor briefly, but I knew of him because he was one of the great thinkers inside the Ministry of Defence and the Defence Village, and he made a big contribution to the way in which the country's defence was organised. I'm here, of course, this evening amid all the publicity that you will have read about today about this constitutional crisis that erupted after the vote in the House of Lords last night. And you'll be glad to know that the House of Lords is again tonight challenging the government on a statutory instrument, that mysterious device that has suddenly emerged out of the darkness to ambush an unsuspecting Chancellor of the Exchequer. Well, I was for 21 years an elected member of the House of Commons. And doing that while being Secretary of State for Defence was always a remarkable discipline, a balancing act. And my favourite story of my time in politics as the Member of Parliament for Hamilton was in the 1987 general election, when I got my biggest majority of my 21 years in Parliament. But at the end of every count, as any of you who have ever participated in a parliamentary election will know, the returning officer takes all the candidates and all of the agents to first of all tell them what the result is likely to be, but before he does that, to allocate the spoilt papers. So I was representing Lanarkshire, so you had a number of papers that said no Pope or more Pope or various sentiments like that, and an individual who'd put a huge angry cross through the whole ballot paper and found that he'd voted Liberal Democrat because the intersection of the cross. But the returning officer came finally to one paper and he held it up, and in tiny, tiny writing in the box beside my name were the words, "They're all shite, but he's the best." And without the glimmer of a smile, the returning officer said, "I intend to give this vote to Mr. Robertson on the grounds that the elector has made his preference quite clear." So in our great democracy, the electors have the last word, and they know how to fix your feet to the ground and occasionally to nail it there as well. But asking me to talk tonight about the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2015, only weeks before its publication, and in the knowledge that copies of the draft are already circulating, could be an exercise in futility. Without being at all partisan, I regret that consultation appears in my eye too limited, and therefore we are still in the dark about emerging thinking. And keeping people guessing on the security of the nation is a wrong formula, and one which endangers the possibility of a consensus outcome. Now, here's what I said in the introduction to the Strategic Defence Review of 1998. I said, "This review is radical, reflecting a changing world in which the confrontation of the Cold War has been replaced by a complex mixture of uncertainty and instability. These problems pose a real threat to our security, whether in the Balkans, the Middle East, or in some trouble spot yet to ignite. And if we are to discharge our international responsibilities in such areas, we must retain the power to act. Our armed forces are Britain's insurance against a whole variety of risks." So that was true then in 1998, and it's true 17 years later now. Yes, we've moved on from the Balkans, I hope anyway, but the Middle East has erupted yet again after the Arab Spring, and we're faced with a huge refugee crisis, a new challenge from Russia, and there are a range of new threats that preoccupy us in this country. All that emphasizes what I said then. We must retain the power to act. That statement and what our domestic and international responsibilities are must be the driving input of the SDR 2015. So I want to give you my top priorities for the review and my hope for the conclusions, and then I'll return to what I believe is the most important aspect of defense and security today, and that is political will. My first priority seems so self-evident that you might wonder at me actually saying it, and that is the review must be truly strategic. Of course, there have to be cost restraints on what we do to keep people in this country and our allies safe and secure, but they should not be the starting point. In 1998, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, pledged that the then Defence Review would be foreign policy led, and we kept to that pledge. Only when the review was actually completed did the argument on finance come in, and that argument took place before the Comprehensive Spending Review. SDSR 2015 will be announced after the Comprehensive Spending Review, and that's a point of real substance. But that juxtaposition of dates quite emphatic, signaled quite emphatically the thoroughness of the review at that time. Now, I can't pretend that the negotiations on how to finance the review were either easy or unbloody. They even involved, and nobody knows this up to now, they involved the possibility of ministerial resignations, but with the Prime Minister's intervention, the whole package was properly financed. So the SDSR 2015 needs to follow the national security strategy, and that document must enumerate and quite crucially must prioritize the internal and external threats that Britain and its people face in the foreseeable future. And it must also leave room for what Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns, because these are the trouble spots yet to ignite that I referred to in 1998. We must keep room for that, for surprises that we don't yet foresee. In 1998, we didn't contemplate the attacks of 9/11 and of 7/7 here in London. We did not then clearly see Afghanistan as the incubator of Al-Qaeda and its transnational terrorism. We couldn't predict the Arab uprisings and the implosions in Syria and in Libya, nor could we forecast that Russia would betray its security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum and annex sovereign territory in Ukraine. We did, however, predict the malign influence of Saddam Hussein, and the cruise missile attacks of 1998, named Operation Desert Fox, were organized by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, with myself and Robin Cook in operational command. And these attacks were based on the same, albeit flawed, intelligence that was to be relied on in 2003. So we must prepare for a catalogue of known threats. We must build capabilities for those that might surprise us. And what we need to do is to watch the trend lines and not just the headlines. Today's headlines, of course, are dominated by ISIS and its carnival of savagery, by the migration waves, by Russian and Chinese behavior. These trends, however, some of them are related to the headlines, the trends that we need to examine, some of them linked to the headlines, are in jihadism and other extreme varieties of nationalisms, separatisms, extreme religions, and insurgencies. They lie in the atomization of existing states and the emergence of failed ones. They lie in smouldering border conflicts. This morning we heard of the Chinese belligerently responding to an American warship going past an artificial island created by the Chinese in international waters, and brings that to life there as well. And of course they lie in impending conflicts about resources like water and energy. And they lie in financial instability in a very interconnected and mutually vulnerable global system. Now that fact, it's a sad and remarkable fact that the issues have all gone global, just as the politics have gone local. And that's not a formula that's going to keep us safe in the future. We know, however, that the British public is not isolationist. The recent Chatham House YouGov survey on attitudes towards the UK's international priorities showed that over 60% of the general public and 60% of opinion formers say they think that the UK should aspire to be, I quote, a great power rather than to accept that it is in decline. And that was the highest level of support for that sentiment since the survey started. So the national security strategy should therefore be about the protection of the British people and their interests at home and abroad, and how we can tap into that aspiration. It must also be about using our privileged position in international bodies like the European Union, the UN, Nato, and the G8, and that's just to name the major platforms, and to be a good and active global citizen. But I say this with some sadness. I think that fact appears to have been lost back here at home. The constant erosion of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the relentless cuts to the defence budget, this agonised debate about EU membership, the unwillingness to engage where we have responsibility, like the Normandy Group on Ukraine. All of these things seem to point in one direction. And all of that, and cuts to the British Council and the BBC World Service, seem to me to signal a retreat from our role in the world. Notwithstanding our burgeoning aid budget, with its privileged protection, and unlike all other budgets, that protection is now built into law. It's estimated that our national external capability has shrunk by 30% in the last 5 years. I was a defence minister and not a foreign minister, but I say this with great seriousness. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office is the brain in the external policy of the United Kingdom. Its work at home and abroad should be the eyes and the ears of the nation in threat spotting, diplomatic engaging, trade promoting, and intelligence gathering, as well as its job in explaining what's happening in the world. The existing butchering of our diplomatic service, which is about to face further amputations, is an unforgivable betrayal of our national standing and our international relevance. How defensible is it that our aid budget of £12 billion a year is protected and increasing when the very government department that fixes the priorities for that aid is restricted and unprotected on a tiny £1.6 billion? And actually, if you strip out the non-discretionary expenditure of the Foreign Office, subscriptions to Nato and to the United Nations, I'm told actually the Foreign Office's core budget is £600 million a year. That is half of what we give to Ethiopia in the aid budget. And that is worth reflecting on. We spent £10 billion on the 2012 Olympic Games in London. And yet we're going to spend a tenth of that amount on our whole diplomatic network and its headquarters And I believe the priorities involved in that situation border on the insane. And anyway, have we become safer and more secure and less vulnerable in these years? I venture to suggest that a jury would give a unanimous and a negative verdict on that particular indictment. My second point about the SDSR is about consultation and the involvement of the public in the wider security and defence world. The 1998 review claimed to have been the subject of the widest and deepest consultation of any previous review. And it's my contention that that is why it got such public and private support from those who had to implement it, and it's principally the reason why it lasted so long without major tweaks. I said at the time that if the review was a success, it would be known as the SDR 1998, and if it was a failure, it would be known as the Robertson Review. I'm glad to announce to you that it is known as the SDR 1998. This 2015 review, which I believe is almost finished and has been done largely behind closed doors, and only in the last few weeks has the inexplicable stringent word limit on outside contributions been limited. Now, I say this because I wrote this bit of my contribution last week. I'm now told that actually there has been quite substantial consultation behind the scenes, but it all started, of course, after the recess, and basically when the review was almost completely written. So I've apologized to those who have seen the earlier drafts of this speech, just in order that they might pay attention to the rest of what I said. But I make the point about consultation not as a partisan point, but as a point of substance. The 2010 SDSR was fatally undermined by the lack of buy-in by the whole security stakeholder base, and its conclusions were therefore weakened and undermined as a consequence. The harsh fact is that national security is not the property of the government of the day. It concerns all of us, and we have a right, a basic civic right, to hear the threat assessments and the dangers affecting us, and to be exposed to the stark choices, some of them financial, involved in a review of this complexity and this importance. And the fact that all of you have come out this evening and filled this hall is an indication of the fact that people actually do want to know and want to hear and be part of the process. My next point is on deterrence. One of my favorite quotes is from the famous General George Marshall, who perceptively said, "The best way to win a war is to prevent it." And that was very wise, and what he was saying is about deterrence. Not just nuclear deterrence, but having a range of capabilities, military, economic, and diplomatic, which will convince a potential adversary that the cost of attacking you and your interests in no way, in any way, would mean unacceptable consequences. Let me start with the nuclear deterrent. Apart from the United States, only France and the UK and Europe have independent nuclear weapon capability. In the face of an increasingly nuclear-armed world, and one where non-friendly and potentially non-friendly states are acquiring nuclear weapons, it would be totally irresponsible for us to abandon our continuous at-sea deterrent. It's invisible, invulnerable, undetectable, and always there. A trident might well be a controversial subject. It shouldn't be. It should be something that is given. Because we're not talking this time, in any event, whatever the propagandists say, about a new weapon system or replacing Trident. The issue in front of us today is only about building the 4 new submarines which will maintain continuous at-sea deterrence with the existing Trident missiles. Yet this issue is a big one in public opinion terms. And it reminds me of the words of somebody who once said, some issues are so important that future generations should have a vote on them. Now, we find it difficult to predict what will happen next week, next month, next year. Never mind foresee the kind of world that will develop over the next 3 to 4 decades. After all, even taking this year, who earlier this year would have foreseen this huge flood of humanity fleeing to Europe? And that's just one example in 1 year. So how can we be sure that these future generations, who won't be able to vote on the go, no-go main gate decision that will be taken in the next few months, how can we be sure that they will be safe in the future if only the difficult, volatile, unstable, and potentially hostile regimes will still be holding nuclear weapons? The new submarines, of course, are going to be expensive. They are very, very complicated pieces of weaponry. But they're not nearly as expensive as the opponents of Trident constantly exaggerate. Over the 30 years of life of the submarines and the system, the cost will be about £2 billion a year. It's a substantial sum of money. That's exactly what the National Health Service spends every week. And that strikes me as being a remarkable juxtaposition of figures. That amount, which is actually 0.13% of government expenditure, is our insurance policy against interstate warfare, and perhaps more importantly, against nuclear blackmail. So anybody harboring the illusion that unilateral nuclear disarmament is anything other than a dangerous gamble should first of all go and look at the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. The Budapest Memorandum was the deal by which the new independent state of Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear weapons and the nuclear arsenal on its territory in return for solemn assurances from Russia, the UK, France, and the US to respect its sovereignty and independence inside existing borders. That was some bargain they got. Then they should go and examine the decades of Britain restructuring and substantially reducing its nuclear role. They can contrast that with the modernization ongoing in Russia's nuclear capability, as well as that of China, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and potentially others. Well, why are these other countries doing that? And will they give them up if we were to make the decision not to go ahead with Trident? These are two questions that I would pose to those who fantasize about the virtuous effects of us getting out of nuclear deterrence. Where I do agree with Trident's critics is when they say that Trident cannot act against threats like the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They are, of course, right in that respect, but nuclear deterrence is not designed for that purpose. Its role is totally different, and other deterrent measures are needed for tackling other threats like terrorism. That's why a robust conventional defense is an integral part of the nation's deterrence posture. Along with our NATO allies, we need to have the quality and the quantity of capabilities which will warn any adversary and potential enemy that an attack, be it conventional, hybrid, asymmetric, will be countered firmly and decisively. And modern capabilities are therefore going to be essential. When I was Secretary of State for Defense, I introduced what we called smart procurement, trying to speed up and make more efficient the procurement of weapons, because I believed as a citizen of this country, never mind as somebody in the British cabinet, that it was an unforgivable waste of defence and the public's money for so many defence projects to be overcost, overtime, and underperforming. In Nato, I said on my first day, going across the NATO headquarters entrance, that my 3 priorities for my time in office were capabilities, capabilities, and capabilities. And it's still the most important priority, and it is lamentable that European countries are still behind the curve on getting the right capabilities for today's threats. Recently, the last chairman of the American Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, revealingly said this. He said, "They pretend to have capabilities, and we pretend to believe them." And I think that sums it up. And I have to say, looking at some of the pictures of defence expenditure, especially in Europe, I've gradually come to the conclusion that the biggest enemy that we actually face in the world today is ourselves. I've seen the enemy, and it's us. Short-sighted, penny-pinching, risk-taking, and blind to our weaknesses. We are, in many ways, our own worst enemy. In the last 5 years, long after I left the MOD, there has been a major shift in the UK procurement process. Under the leadership of the Chief of Defence Materiel, Sir Bernard Grey, who was once my special advisor, and using the reforms to the procurement process engineered by Tom McCain, who was once my principal private secretary, that what's called DE&S has achieved the very rare accolade of a commendation from the National Audit Office just last week. And it's a long time since the National Audit Office has been anything other than scathing about the Ministry of Defence's procurement situation. So I hope that Sir Bernard's considerable progress is going to be maintained by his successor. Now, you'll hardly be surprised when I say that my next priority for the SDSR is the strength of NATO. The British commitment to the 2% of GDP laid down by the Alliance for Defence Expenditure that was recently announced by the Prime Minister is good news for this country, and as well as that for NATO too. But only if it's true. Only if it's true. Rumours abound that financial engineers are burrowing away inside the system, manipulating figures, shifting budget heads, reclassifying expenditures in other departments, all in order to ensure that the 2% commitment is satisfied without there being any extra cash. Now, if this rumour is correct, not saying it is, but it's well talked about, then it won't fool anybody, and nor should it. Defence and security is too important for any kind of political three-card trick. And as I often said in NATO, the 2% only makes sense if it's actually spent on the right things. Deployable troops, precision weapons, logistics, and specialist people. 2% extra on the relics of the past adds no value and simply wastes taxpayers' money. You know, titularly when I was Secretary General of NATO, I was the political head of an organisation which, in extremis, had 2.5 million European people in uniform in the structure, of whom about 2% were capable of being deployed outside of national boundaries. There are in the European arsenal, I think even now, 10,000 main battle tanks, something that is almost useless in any current unforeseeable conflict in the future, but lying there rusting and soaking up expenditure. There are 10,000 fast jets among the European air forces, with under 10% of that's more than the Americans have got in their whole fleet. with only a fraction of them capable of flying day and night in all weathers and delivering precision weapons. The only kind of weapons that are now acceptable to public opinion and inside international law. So it only makes sense, expenditure, if it's being spent on the kind of things that we'll need in the future as well. NATO is the cornerstone of our defence. That's repeatedly said by government ministers, repeatedly said by the 28 nations of NATO itself. It's a force multiplier. And in a world where no nation has the resources to act alone, and that applies to the United States just as it does to others, the strength, resilience, and the determination of the alliance is absolutely essential. And there also must be given a priority to sorting the NATO-EU relationship on defence. Given the security threats that we see day and daily now around the Mediterranean Sea, Europe is going to have to face new challenges on its own doorstep, and there will simply be no freeloading on the backs of the Americans if something happens again. It's too often been muttered around at the moment that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, that is the core security guarantee of the alliance, an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. And they say now that it's been weakened in recent times with the enlargement of the alliance. Well, I actually doubt that. Thinking of it in abstract terms gives rise to a debate, a necessary debate. But when the emergency actually occurs, as it did on my watch, the fundamental pillar of common security binds all states in the alliance. And the only person who's ever invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, maybe the only one who ever needed to invoke Article 5 of the treaty. And actually, when you look back at the history of NATO and its birth, its agonized birth in 1949, and if you read the speeches by members of the United States Senate, they're really quite revealing. Senators who said, we know what this is about. The Europeans are going to get into another civil war and expect us to come and fight it for them. There was really, quite considerable hostility to that concept, which was designed, of course, to make sure that America was not going to do what it did in the First World War or the Second World War. And enlightened Americans knew that, but enlightenment is not necessarily a guarantee to get you elected to the United States Senate. I was at a meeting a few months ago where a former chief of the defense staff said he was looking forward to the first meeting between Prime Minister Corbyn and President Trump. And he was told by a number of politicians in the room that he should stop making jokes like that. So, but in case the idea gets traction that Article 5 is not as serious as it has been in the past, it's important for all NATO members to reiterate their commitment to it. I'm reminded of an official parking sign I saw in New York which said, "Don't even think about parking here." Well, that's the message. That is the message of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. And it needs to be prominent and it needs to be proclaimed loudly. It also has to be rehearsed. The military know what to do when an order is given. But politics is a more subtle science. Knowing and exercising the political process of invoking Article 5 is a way of both refreshing knowledge of the pledge, but also of alerting others to the fact that it is being taken seriously. And we in NATO, I strongly believe, in this troubled world, have got to make sure that our house is in order. If the Russians and others think that NATO nations are divided and decadent and lack the will to stand up for our interests, then we've got to address that perception. I think a huge own goal was scored when the House of Commons here in August 2013 voted against the government's advice on attacking Syria when it crossed the so-called red line by using chemical weapons. That declaration of weakness has now got to be reversed because it gave a very, very clear sign to Presidents Assad and Putin and Rouhani that the West did not have the will to defend its values and its commitments. And it's my strong opinion that it was this demonstration of feebleness which led directly to President Putin acting with such boldness, first of all in Crimea and then in eastern Ukraine. And that then is the crucial issue in this debate on the defence and security of our country. Political will. Political will. All the analysis in the world, all the equipment, all the technology, all the highly trained men and women in uniform, none of that is of any utility at all if the political will to take action is not there. A ship in harbour is safe, but that's not what a ship is for, said a wise person in the past, and it's a thought worth bearing in mind. But even more important than the ability to act is producing in an adversary's mind that you have the willingness to act and act decisively. In my introduction, going back again to the 1998 SDR, I made this point, quotes, "If we ask our forces to fight, we must make sure they will win." Again, it sounds self-evident, but we need to keep it in mind. And it's not such a statement of the blindingly obvious if you examine our attitude in recent fights. Take Northern Ireland. Laterally in Northern Ireland, under first John Major and then Tony Blair, it became obvious that violence could not be stopped without a political process. When there was a process and the military was in support of the civil power, the violence stopped. In Bosnia, after the Dayton Agreement produced a political framework, the military might of Nato and 65,000 troops brought the killing to an end. In Kosovo in 1999, the objective we set out was absolutely clear. It's got me an entry in the Oxford Book of Political Quotations. It was summed up as Serbs out, NATO in, refugees home. And faced with a relentless information war, the daily repetition of the message, NATO does not do losing, combined with precision military strikes, Milosevic caved in. But contrast that with Iraq, where a successful, highly successful military invasion was followed by a chaotic US Defense Department attempt to put a cap on an implosion with no relevant Iraqis left to create the new state. And in Afghanistan, the purpose of the NATO mission was to be security and assistance. ISAF, International Security and Assistance Force. Afghanistan had an elected government, a President Karzai. But as the campaign went on, the military and political objectives became mixed, with the latter, the military, taking precedence. If we had paid twice as much attention to the political track as we relentlessly did in the military, then we might be more confident as we leave. And I noticed that the Prime Minister has announced today that 500 troops will continue to stay in Afghanistan, and the Americans are leaving 9,000 troops there as well. In Libya, take Libya, a wholly justified operation was mounted with a unanimous NATO decision but patchy participation to save the people of Benghazi. That effort succeeded and the mandate was stretched, a fact which incidentally will guarantee a Russian veto for any subsequent application for a UN mandate. Gaddafi was brought down, so far so good, and then we went home. The result? two rival governments, violent militias running the show, and an open port for the procession of migrants. That's the legacy. A foreign official in another country told me that we had created an Afghanistan by the sea. So in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, we used our brilliant military assets really well. Huge human sacrifice was involved and a mountain of cash was spent. But where was the information war? Press coverage limited to the coverage of casualties. Political VIPs on fleeting visits to grip and grin the troops. Little done to inform the public at home and in theatre about what we were there for. Little done then and indeed now to give our troops the feeling that their efforts and sacrifice was actually worth it. Barely a speech in Parliament or on the international bully pulpit to get the message to the enemy that they were going to be defeated and that the Afghan people could choose a government and not jihad. It was a famous American war correspondent, Ed Murrow, who pointed out Winston Churchill's rhetorical role in World War II. He said, and I'm sure we've all heard this before, Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. So through Churchill's powerful rhetoric and his single-minded will to win, he inspired the British people to defiance. And crucially, he persuaded Hitler that we were stronger than we actually were. And if he had not done that, especially at that time and then right throughout the rest of the war, this lecture would be being delivered in the German language. So why was such resolution not shown in the fight against the Taliban? Why did our present Prime Minister make only a couple of House of Commons speeches on the Afghanistan campaign and his predecessor exactly the same? We should, I think, always remember the words of Leon Trotsky. Not something I am known to say in public. But Leon Trotsky once said, in another time, he said, "You may not be interested in this war, but this war is interested in you." And that was the case in Afghanistan, and we may rue the day. So, ladies and gentlemen, my conclusion then is this. If the SDSR 2015 does not get it right, does not provide the prioritization of threats and identify and supply the means of countering them, then it will fall short of what the British people demand and what the British people deserve. It and the national security strategy must look at the world of today and tomorrow, unlike the 2010 review, which contemplated a much more benign world than the one that we're facing just now. If the review doesn't face up to the fact that providing safety and protection for our people and their interests means hard choices and harder decisions, which will be neither cheap nor pain-free, then this review, like the last one, will fail. And in that failure will lie huge and unquantifiable risks for future generations, who I guess will find it very difficult to forgive us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, Field Marshal. Can you hear me? I'm sounding quite live here, but it may be my heart in need of a defibrillator. I did actually once give this lecture too. Totally trivial pursuit footnote. But proposing a vote of thanks after such a tour de force and magnificent tour d'horizon may seem odious or superfluous, but many, many thanks indeed for a thoroughly stimulating disquisition, which will give us a lot to think about for a long time. For me, it's a bit like the missing Just So story by Rudyard Kipling, how the minnow had to acknowledge the whale, or the mouse, the lion. Because Lord Robertson was really the great architect of the SDR 1998, a template of its time in a way that not many, I think, in this country realized. Certainly it was imitated and admired throughout European NATO and the US. Broadly speaking, not sparing Lord Robertson's blushes, it's got it right in a way that it is now absolutely clear that SDSR 2010 got it wrong. It's very important that we address this milestone of an SDSR, which the incoming coalition government in 2010 said should happen every 5 years. It should not be a matter of routine, because it says who we are as a nation, the strategic necessities and choices, how we work with allies against a changing landscape of risks and threats, of which we heard a very eloquent account from Lord Robertson. But I was just thinking, coming here this afternoon, how much of that landscape would Peter Naylor recognise? A great deal of it he would recognise, but quite a lot he wouldn't. Nuclear proliferation, yes. He would have wrestled with that, and we heard a very fine account of why deterrence, keeping up with the know-how, is vital in the present world. But the theology, the terms of the theology shifts from bilateral deterrence, mutually assured destruction, to a multilateral context. We have Russia, China, Pakistan, India, North Korea, all developing nuclear capability, and I dare say Israel as well. And in the wings, we estimate, that is the defense academic and journalistic community, there are at least 10 to 12 actively prosecuting certainly the intellectual properties required for nuclear armament, which can be relatively cheap, if not actively considering the acquisition of weapons. And we heard about the informal asymmetric threats. And now we have a new term coming into the vocabulary, non-obvious forms of warfare. So we have nuclear, biological, and chemical, the rubric that journalists use. But I fear that journalists are not discussing enough the new capabilities, which have been on the horizon for some time, electromagnetic pulses, but also genetic modification. Being one of the Red-Headed League, I belong to a seminar at King's College where we discuss weapons of genetic modification getting into the genome, whereby you can attack groups with red hair, with blue eyes, differentiating Hazara from Pashto, for example. Now, as we've heard, the SDSR comes at the season of the National Security Strategy and the Comprehensive Spending Review. And I fear, for what is required for the future of the country, and here I am 150% in agreement with our speaker tonight, the cart is going to drive the horse if we look at the money first and not the strategic landscape first and what we are required to do on behalf of our people and their vital allies. Frankly, I would be even ruder than Lord Robertson was about the National Security Strategy of 2010. It looked like William Hague's laundry list. It was one damn thing after another, no idea of priority, no idea of what we should do about it. But here we come into an area looking at the fact that the money men will get into, and women will get into this very, very early on, for obvious reasons, and water doesn't flow uphill. It's the balance of resources and requirements. What you have to do and what you'd like to do, what you're obliged to do, but what you think you might want to do. Difficult choices, but it must offer prospect for the future in the way that Lord Robertson has underlined. The last SDSR, 2010, was driven by fiscal necessity. Cuts deemed to be unavoidable given the state of the nation's finances. And now there are real concerns about equipment and technical capability and human resources, which have stemmed from the legacy of that review. What I would like to do, just in the next 2 or 3 minutes, is to emphasize how much we must invest as a nation and in all our public endeavors in personnel, in people, men and women, boys and girls, the retired or the not quite so retired, bringing a whole variety of skills to what is vital for the security and stability of our world. Investment in research and development, R&D, has been allowed to fall, and it has been reduced drastically by government. From R&D into submarine warfare, look at Lord Hennessy, Peter Hennessy's new book on the submarine service, and look at the dramatic cut in engineers. Understandable, but a huge risk, to quote Lord Robertson, to cyber, to how we exercise force, to hard power, soft power, smart power in the new context. But just to think that I'm not going off on some cloud of fantasy, the armed services, and I sat in on the High Command Staff course with all 3 chiefs of the services now currently serving. But George Zambellis of the Navy, Andy Pulford of the RAF, Nick Carter, they all agree our armed services, professional armed services, are at least 3,000 short in technically qualified engineers. And it is a devil of a job how to replace them. This decline in training in engineering skills was spotted, but we found it difficult to remedy it. The investment in personnel is as crucial or more crucial than in exquisite technologies and weaponry, given the new context. The last defence reviews, including Lord Robertson's, were in the post-Cold War context. And the one of 2010, the SDSR 2010, came in the era of the post-intervention, the big interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We have gone, thinking from 1989, the end of the Cold War, from confrontation and mutually assured destruction, to hot peace, tensions with Russia, to the so-called wars among the people, as my friend Sir Rupert Smith would refer to it, Cheap Jack stealing one of Mao Zedong's most famous phrases and configurations of guerrilla warfare, but war among the people. But now, and I think this does help us as an intellectual tool for understanding, if not understanding how to approach it, to understanding the phenomenon that is Al-Qaeda / ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, or Daesh, as they call it there, that kind of phenomenon, which is both actual and virtual. We are now in a state, and let us not deceive ourselves, of what is known as continuing and continuous conflict. This is the new landscape, unstable fragmentation. What was a set of storms once on a distant horizon has become frighteningly close, bringing turbulence and conflict. The change in environment is going to be one of the ingredients in this. Climate and ecological change, population increase and decline, the inverted rates of fertility, mortality, and not forget, diseases, morbidity. Population movement is going to be a huge consideration. It is a huge consideration. And I wonder how much this is going to be flagged up in the national security strategy. And though I have contributed on the margins, I'm not convinced it will get the priority it deserves in the forthcoming Strategic Defence and Security Review at the end of November. This has a tremendous impact. Environmental change, population increase and decline in certain places, and population movement does have huge impact on social cohesion and governance. But sometimes I find it very difficult to persuade people that this is the meat and drink, the key material of an SDSR, National Security Strategy process, which should be open, as Lord Robertson said. It is for the people, by the people, and with the people. We are facing the phenomenon. We are in the era of the decades of greatest population expansion. Ladies and gentlemen, your and my lifetime, we'll have witnessed what is a process in little over a century of the global human population doubling itself to 11.8 billion around 20 at the outside. In that time, Africa will go from 1.5 billion to 5 or 6. Big implications. This does affect the stability and cohesion and the governance of our world and how we manage it. It will require smart power, the mixture of hard power, soft power, using Joe Nye's formula, smart power. Stability and security in an increasingly incoherent world. That is the watchword for this season of defence reviews and strategic national security strategy reviews, and we have been given an excellent and appropriate guide as to how we should begin to approach it, all of us, from Lord Robertson this evening.